Hi everyone, first of all I want to apologize for this being a little later than I would like it to have been. I recorded it this morning and it crashed on me, so I am now re-recording Chapter 8. So at Chapter 8 we're talking about scheduling resources and costs. Outline of what we're going to cover, we'll talk about resource scheduling problems, the types of resource constraints that exist, classification of a scheduling problem, resource allocation methods. We'll briefly talk, if you look in the material, on computer demonstration of resource constraint scheduling. However, we're not using MS Project in this course, so we won't go into depth there. What happens when we split activities, benefits of scheduling resources, assigning project work, and then the concept of what happens when we have multi-project resource schedules and using these resource schedules simply to develop a project cost baseline. So we've done our scope and our WBS, we've created our network, we have gone back and forth with what risks we think that exist in those things, and now we're going to take all those things, put them together, and start working on this resource and cost scheduling so that hopefully eventually we can get to our master plan. Overview of resource scheduling problem. So resources and priorities. Project network times are not a schedule until resources have been assigned. There are always more project proposals available than resources, and so you can't put your network and timing together until you know there's resources to do the project. And the project priority team will only add new projects if the resources are available. Cost estimates are not a budget until they have been time phased. Once resource assignments have been finalized, you're able to develop a baseline budget schedule for the project, because you don't know exactly when you're going to do things or how you have to do them. Is there any time where we're going to have to crunch activities together and pay more money, or are we stretching them out to try and save costs? So we really need to time phase things to have a budget in place. Resource scheduling problems. So there is resource smoothing, which involves an attempt to even out the varying demands on resources by delaying non-critical activities, using up that slack to lower peak resources. When we go to another slide, I'll show you pictures of how this looks. So we might have periods of time where we need a whole bunch of one resource, and then other periods where we don't need as much. And we're going to try and blend that so that we can use the most achievable amount of resources rather than having resources sitting idle at points and then having to get extra resources at other times. And then resource constrained scheduling occurs when resources are not adequate to meet the peak demands. The late start of some activities may be delayed, and the duration of the project may have to be increased. So if the answer is we simply cannot get more resources, whether that's equipment, people, or materials, to do the job, then we may have to increase the time that the project takes. Types of project constraints. So there's the technical or logical constraints, and this, when we go to the next slide, you'll see a sequence of events, and those events have to happen in a certain order to make it work. There's resource constraints. So if only certain people are able to do certain tasks, and those people aren't available, or only certain equipment can be used for certain tasks and it's taken with other stuff, then you have a resource constraint in front of you, and how do we work around that? Note that resource dependency takes priority over the technological dependency, but it does not violate the technological dependency. So we need the resources. A resource constraint is a very large problem, but we still can't paint walls if the drywall isn't up yet. So what types of resource constraints can we have? As I discussed before, we can have people, we can have materials, and we can have equipment. Technical constraints. So you can see here we have a plan, and now to execute that plan, we need refreshments, we need to decorate the hall and hire a band, and once we have those things complete, then we can have a reception. In the resource constraint department, we only have certain people that can do the job, so the person planning it is also got to hire the band, they need to decorate the hall, they're going to purchase the refreshments, and they're going to set up for the reception. And so if there's no more resources available to do those things at the same time, then we have to put them in line of priority and complete them that way. Time-constrained project must be completed by an imposed date. So in that case, you're probably going to look at ways to add resources, whether that's working overtime, getting extra equipment in order to make it happen. And why would we do this? Think if there's a government mandate for a changeover to happen, or we're trying to exploit a market and we want to be first to market, we're going to put a date on that and we're going to stick to it. Resource constrained projects would be kind of the other side of things. We only have so much available to us that we can use. And so in order to make that happen, we may have to extend our time so that those resources are able and adequate to do what we need to do to finish the project. Limiting assumptions. So what are some limiting assumptions on a project? That splitting activities will not be allowed. Splitting refers to interrupting work on one task and assigning the resources to work on a different task for a period of time and then reassigning them to the original job. So if the project, the task was going to take, let's say, 5 days, and we were going to go 5 days straight, but on day 3 we need Susie for a different job, we're going to go 3 days, and then there's going to be some break in the schedule, and then we're going to have the 2 days. And so what happens when Susie's not working in this time? Well, when she has to get back up and running on these future days, it may not be as seamless. And there may be things, that take extra time that it wouldn't have if we did 5 days in a row. Risk assumptions that we would have, that would be activities with the most slack pose the least risk. Reduction of flexibility does not increase risk. So if we take time out of the schedule, and put the activities in line, that we're not increasing the risk of the project, and the nature of an activity, whether easy or complex, doesn't increase the risk. Time constrained projects. So we could be resource constrained, now we're time constrained. We're going to do it to whatever time we're told. Focus on the resource utilization and making the most of it. We're going to try and level and smooth activities where we can, to make sure that we're using our resources that we have available. The goal of smoothing resource demand, reduce the peak of demand for the resource, reduce the number of resources over the life of the project, and minimize the fluctuation in resource demand. The downside of smoothing the resources is we're going to lose flexibility in terms of reducing the slack, and it creates more critical activities. So now we've spread out where things are happening, and before, if they were delayed, we would be okay. Now we don't have that delay time frame to take into consideration. So here's a project for Botanical Gardens, and as you can see, the way it was originally set up, there's 2 backhoes needed, and then 4 backhoes needed, and then 1 backhoe needed, and then 3. So shown here the same way, 2, then we need 4, and then we just need 1 for this period of time, and then we need 3. So how can we best level load that so we don't need extra equipment? And in this case, when they smoothed it, they're able to see that for most of the time they can get away with having 2, and then it only has to go up to 3 for this period of time, and we get rid of that need for a 4th backhoe. Resource constrained projects are limited in the quantity or availability. Activities are scheduled using heuristics, so rules of thumb to follow, that first we look at things with minimum slack, smallest and least duration, and then finally the lowest activity identification number. Parallel method is used to apply the heuristics. The parallel method is an iterative process that starts from the beginning of the project, and when resources are needed exceed the resources available, we retain activities first by their priority rules. So where are we going to retain and keep activities and put the resources based on what activities are priority? So you can see that happening here. They've built their schedule up, and now they're going to adjust their schedule based on their constrained resources. Resource constrained schedule through the period. So what happens is originally they were going to end on week 12, but now it's clear they're going to have to go out 2 more weeks because they need to spread out the resources that they have available to make the project work. Impacts of resource constrained scheduling. So what happens if you're resource constrained? You reduce the slack and therefore the flexibility. So we need to kind of micromanage and look at things a little closer. When we talked about risk last week, how does this affect that? Well, now we're going to take a look and say, we don't have the flexibility if something goes wrong. So before, where we might have let it go, let's say 3 or 4 days before we stepped in and did something, maybe now we need to have that time frame reduced back, and after 48 hours we're doing something if things are not going right. It increases the number of critical and near critical activities because you've taken that slack out of the system. Everything is condensed. Increases scheduling complexity because resource constraints are added to the technical constraints. It may make traditional critical path no longer meaningful. So we knew what our critical path was before based on what timing we thought we would take, but now that we've done these things, that path is not the critical path. We have to look for what the new one is and really focus on those activities. and it can break the sequence and leave the network with a set of disjointed critical activities. May cause parallel activities to become sequential, so activities we're going to do at the same time, now we can't, and can change activities from critical to non-critical. So something that seemed like it was going to be the concern of the project before, now is not, because other things have taken priority and focus. Splitting activities, it's the scheduling technique used to get a better project schedule and or increase resource utilization, involves interrupting the work and sending the resources for another activity for a period of time and then having them resume. It can be useful if the work involved does not include large startup or shutdown costs, and it's considered a major reason why projects fail to meet schedule. So when we do these split outs, it's oftentimes difficult to get us back up and running at the same rate we were before we split off the activity. So here's an example of them splitting off the activity, and when the shutdown and startup takes more time, then we've added time to the equation, where before we could have just simply gone from activity A to B to C. And here's the activity duration without splitting, right? We've gone A, B, C, and now you can see we've added in these time blocks as we went along for the startup and shutdown. Benefits of scheduling resources. So why are we scheduling our resources when we're talking about these things? It leaves time for considering reasonable alternatives. If the machinery or the people are not available during the specific period of time, maybe we change how things are happening or who's doing it or what kind of machinery it's going to be done on. We're going to look at our cost and time trade-offs. Do we have extra time in a certain area and then we can reduce our costs, or are we short on time and we're going to have to pay additional costs for overtime or extra people? Change in priorities. Did things change from what before was important? And now we're going to look at how that affects things. Provide the information needed to prepare a time-phased work package budgets with the dates. So now, how are we managing what our project looks like and we know our success? By really having the budget with dates across a time phase period of time, and we're kind of checking the boxes as we go along to make sure we're following our schedule based on these budget costs. And to gauge the impact of unforeseen events, to assess how much flexibility we have over certain resources. So do we have flexibility, or do we have to make sure that the resource goes to the next activity as soon as possible? Assigning project work. Why we should not always assign the best people to the most difficult tasks. They can become resentful for always having to do it. And then the less experienced people are also resentful because they're never given the opportunity. So can we somehow build a team together to show the less experienced how to do it, so that the best people then know they won't always be the ones that has to come in on a Saturday because no one else can do the job, that they've fully trained somebody else, and those other people feel empowered and more likely to want to take on other tasks in the job. Factors to be considered in deciding who should work together. So minimize unnecessary tension, complement each other. A lot of what project management is managing people and working with them to get the best outcome. Experience team veterans up with new hires, as I said, get them both at the kind of a level skill set, and they can help each other out, and then they can cover off for each other. And that just helps with your succession planning too. Is that other person always going to be here? No. And so we need to know that there's a backup if something were to happen. And then finally, future needs. Have people work together early so that they can be familiar with each other. Using the resource schedule to develop a project cost baseline. So why a time-phase baseline is needed to determine if the project is on, ahead, or behind schedule and over or under its budgeted cost. So here's what we expected to spend by week 4 and how much did we actually spend. And then you're going to do things like assess whether that amount you spent got you the work done that was needed. Or is there a gap in it to actually do the project? Did we need more labor or more cost of some sort than what we had budgeted? And so now we're over and we need to figure out how we're going to manage our budget as we go along. And then it's this time-phased budget. Assign each work package to a responsible person, compare plan, schedule, and costs as an integrative system called earned value. So did we earn the value we expected by this period of time? And generate cash flow statements and resource usage schedules. So that is now the end of chapter 8.